What about the differences and feeling like you were going to disappoint your parents?
Oh, dude, that needs to be a whole episode.
It does.
So I knew when I was 13 that I didn't want to be a plural marriage.
Imagine growing up in a family that millions of people watched every week. A family that looked enormous, complicated, and sometimes chaotic on television, but still presented itself as a family trying to make everything work. Now imagine being one of the children inside that family and years later realizing that what you thought was normal wasn't actually normal to you at all. That is what makes Maddie Brush's latest revelation so powerful. Because Maddie isn't simply talking about an old sister wives storyline. She's talking about the childhood she actually lived. And one sentence from her recent reflection has left fans stopping and asking a much bigger question. What was life really like for Kody Brown's children when the cameras weren't showing everything? Maddie recently described her childhood as chaotic and said she didn't grow up knowing what peace felt like. She explained that much of her adult life has involved understanding those experiences and intentionally building something different for herself and her children. And that is where this story gets much deeper. Because Maddie isn't simply saying, my childhood was difficult. She's explaining how those experiences influenced the kind of mother, wife, and person she wanted to become. And perhaps most importantly, she's saying the cycle stops with her. For longtime Sister Wives viewers, Maddie isn't a new face. Fans watched her grow up. They watched her go from a young teenager in a massive Brown family to a young woman preparing for marriage. They watched her relationship with Caleb develop. They watched Kody walk her down one of the biggest chapters of her life. And over the years, viewers saw Maddie become a wife, a mother, and eventually someone increasingly independent from the world she grew up in. But television can only show so much. A reality show can capture arguments, it can capture family meetings, it can capture tears, it can capture celebrations, but it cannot necessarily capture what a child feels internally while growing up inside a complicated family structure. And Maddie's latest words suggest that there was an internal experience that viewers didn't fully understand. She described her childhood as chaotic and said she didn't grow up knowing what peace felt like, not simply in the sense of having a quiet house, but in the deeper sense of being able to relax and feel safe. That distinction matters. Because Maddie's message isn't really about whether her childhood looked dramatic every single day. It's about what chaos can feel like when it becomes familiar. That statement became the emotional center of Maddie's June 29 reflection. She explained that her childhood was chaotic in ways she has spent her entire adult life trying to understand, while also choosing to create something completely different. And then she described what happened next. Maddie got married young. She became a mother. She moved across the country. And somewhere during that journey, she began building the life she said she hadn't grown up with. Peace, not perfection, not a life without problems, but a life where calm could be intentionally chosen even when problems existed. That is an incredibly important distinction, because Maddie isn't claiming that adulthood magically erased everything from her childhood. Instead, she's saying she had to learn a different way of living. And that changes the entire way we look at her story. Think about the timeline. Maddie grew up as one of Kody and Janelle Brown's children in a plural family that eventually became one of reality television's most recognizable families. The Browns didn't just have a complicated family tree. They had multiple households, multiple parental relationships, constant moves, financial pressures, religious expectations, sibling relationships, and eventually the enormous pressure of having cameras documenting their lives. And Maddie was growing up through all of it. She wasn't watching Sister Wives. She was part of Sister Wives. That difference is huge. For viewers, an argument between adults might have been an episode. For a child inside the family, however, family conflict could simply be part of everyday life. And Maddie's recent comments suggest that she has spent years trying to separate what she once accepted as normal from what she actually wants for herself. That is why her statement about peace feels so much bigger than a simple social media post. Just when fans were processing Maddie's comments about her childhood, she went even further. In another July reflection, Maddie discussed the patterns she has intentionally refused to carry into her own home. She said there were things her children would never be exposed to and explained that she had made those decisions long before becoming a mother. Most strikingly, she said she knew at around 13 years old that she didn't want the life she was living. She couldn't change her circumstances as a child, but she could decide what she would and wouldn't carry forward. Stop there for a second. because that tells us something important. Maddie's transformation didn't begin after Sister Wives became successful. It didn't begin after she became an adult. According to her own account, the decision began when she was a teenager. At 13, she was already thinking about the kind of future she wanted, already thinking about what she didn't want to repeat, and already recognizing that certain patterns around her weren't something she wanted to reproduce in her own future family. Maddie's message about breaking patterns has become one of the strongest parts of this entire story. She described refusing instability where stability should exist, fear where safety should exist, secrets where honesty should exist, and chaos being treated as normal. That is powerful language. But there's something else about it that makes this story especially emotional. Maddie isn't presenting herself as someone who has everything figured out. She's not saying she's created some perfect family. Instead, she's describing peace as something she continues to practice, something she has to choose, something she has to intentionally protect. And that may be the biggest lesson in her entire story. Now, here's where the story becomes much more complicated. It would be easy to turn this into another Maddie versus Kody story. And yes, Kody's relationship with Maddie is absolutely part of the bigger picture, but Maddie's words are broader than that. She is talking about patterns. She's talking about her upbringing. She's talking about parenting. She's talking about what happens when someone grows up surrounded by dynamics they later decide they don't want to reproduce. So reducing everything to Maddie is angry at her father would actually miss the bigger message, because Maddie is telling fans something much more personal. She made a conscious decision to build a different kind of home, and that decision appears to be at the center of the life she's creating today. Of course, fans can't discuss Maddie's childhood without eventually arriving at Kody, because the father-daughter relationship has been strained for years. In a previous Sister Wives storyline, Maddie made it clear that she was not completely closing the door on forgiveness or reconciliation, but she also established an important condition. If Kody wanted to be welcomed back into her life, she said there would need to be a pattern of consistency. And that word, consistency, is incredibly important when you place it next to her latest comments about childhood, because what does a child need when everything around them feels complicated? Consistency, predictability, safety, trust. And Maddie's adult life appears to be heavily focused on creating those things for her own children. So when she says she won't repeat certain patterns, fans naturally start wondering whether her relationship with Kody is connected to those decisions. But we should be careful here. Maddie has not publicly said that every part of her childhood was caused by Kody personally. And she has not said that every experience in the Brown family was negative. Her statements are about her experience and the choices she's making now. That distinction matters. Maddie's story becomes even more interesting when you look at the life she's created with her husband, Caleb. She married young and eventually moved across the country. Today, she is raising her children while pursuing a slower and more intentional lifestyle. She has described herself as a deeply intentional mother and has spoken about homeschooling, holistic living, and building Tata Farms with Caleb and her mother, Janelle. Look at the contrast. The young Maddie who couldn't control the environment she was born into became the adult Maddie who could control the environment she created. That is the transformation at the heart of this story. She couldn't choose her childhood, but she could choose her adulthood. She couldn't decide what family circumstances existed around her when she was 13, but she could decide what would happen inside her own home years later. And according to Maddie, she made that decision very deliberately. There's another fascinating layer here. Maddie's mother, Janelle, is now part of the life Maddie is building. Janelle relocated to North Carolina to be closer to Maddie and her grandchildren, and the two have also been working on their Tata Farms project together. So while the Brown family structure that viewers knew has fractured dramatically, Maddie's relationship with her mother appears to have developed into something different: a partnership, a grandmother-mother relationship, a new family environment. And now Janelle herself is entering another major chapter, having recently gone public with her relationship with Pete, which means the Brown family story is no longer simply about what happened in the past. It's increasingly about what the adult children are building after leaving that old structure behind, because Maddie's story raises a question that may be even bigger than her childhood. If Maddie spent years trying to create peace, what happens when the person she says she needs consistency from is her own father? Kody has publicly said the door is open to his children. Maddie has said she is open to forgiveness and reconciliation. So why haven't they simply repaired the relationship? And what exactly would Kody have to do to prove that he can be a consistent presence in Maddie's life? Because if Maddie's latest revelations tell us anything, it's this. She isn't interested in repeating the past. She isn't interested in pretending chaos was normal, and she isn't willing to sacrifice the peaceful life she's built just to recreate an old family dynamic. The little girl who once couldn't choose her circumstances is now the mother who gets to choose the circumstances her children grow up in. And that may be the most powerful part of Maddie Brush's entire Sister Wives story. But there is still another layer because Maddie's comments didn't come in isolation. Another Brown child has recently started speaking publicly about growing up in the family, and those revelations could make Maddie's story look even more significant. There is something deeply uncomfortable about looking back at your childhood and realizing that the things you once accepted as normal were actually things you had simply learned to live with. And that may be exactly what makes Maddie Brush's recent reflections so emotional, because Maddie isn't looking back at her childhood from the perspective of a teenager who is angry at her parents. She's looking back as an adult mother, a woman who now has children of her own, a woman who has had years to process what she experienced, and perhaps most importantly, a woman who can now compare the environment she grew up in with the environment she wants her own children to experience. That comparison appears to have changed everything. When viewers first met Maddie on Sister Wives, she was simply one of Kody and Janelle's children. She was young, she was outspoken, she had strong opinions, and she was growing up in an environment that was already attracting enormous public attention. But as the years passed, Maddie's identity became less connected to being Kody Brown's daughter and more connected to the life she was creating for herself. She married Caleb. She became a mother. She moved away. She established her own household. And eventually, she became someone who could look at the Brown family dynamic from the outside. That distance matters. Sometimes you can't fully understand your childhood while you're still living inside it. You simply adapt. You learn the rules. You learn how everyone communicates. You learn what causes conflict. You learn what keeps the peace. And then years later, you have your own home, your own spouse, your own children, and suddenly you begin asking questions you never had the freedom to ask before. Was that actually healthy for me? Did I feel safe? Did I feel heard? Did I know what peace was? Maddie's recent comments suggest those questions have been part of her adult journey. Let's go back to the word that immediately caught fans' attention, chadak. Maddie used that word when reflecting on her childhood. And while viewers may interpret the word differently, Maddie's own explanation gives it emotional weight. She described growing up without really knowing what peace felt like. That doesn't automatically mean every day of her childhood was terrible. It doesn't mean she doesn't love members of her family. And it doesn't mean every memory she has is negative. Human experiences are complicated. You can love your family and still acknowledge that certain parts of your upbringing were difficult. You can appreciate your parents and still recognize that they made choices you don't want to repeat. You can have You can have wonderful memories and painful memories at the same time. That's one reason Maddie's comments are so important. She's not presenting childhood as black and white. She's talking about patterns. And patterns are often easier to recognize when you're older. There is a reason so many people say becoming a parent changes the way you understand your own parents. Suddenly, you're looking at a tiny person who depends on you. You start thinking about what makes a child feel secure. You think about routines. You think about emotional safety. You think about communication. You think about whether your child knows they can come to you when something is wrong. And eventually, you may start comparing that with your own childhood. For Maddie, motherhood appears to have been a major turning point. She wasn't just raising children. She was asking herself, what do I want them to remember about growing up? And that question appears to have produced some very strong answers. She didn't want her children to inherit the instability she associated with her own childhood. She didn't want them growing up thinking chaos was simply part of family life. And she didn't want them to reach adulthood and have to figure out what peace was for themselves. That is a powerful goal. This may be one of the most fascinating details in Maddie's story. According to her later reflection, she began thinking about breaking certain patterns when she was around 13 years old. Think about that age. 13 is still incredibly young. You're still trying to figure out who you are. You're still dependent on adults. You don't control where you live. You don't control your family's decisions. You don't control the circumstances surrounding you. But Maddie says she already knew there were things she didn't want to carry into her future. That tells us something about her personality. She wasn't simply reacting as an adult. She had apparently been thinking about these issues for years, and perhaps that's why her current life seems so intentionally structured. She didn't wake up one day and randomly decide she wanted a peaceful home. She had been imagining that kind of life long before she was actually able to create it. Because Sister Wives viewers know how quickly a statement about one Brown family member can become a debate about another. Maddie says her childhood was chaotic. Fans immediately want to ask, was Kody responsible? Was Janelle responsible? Was plural marriage responsible? Was the television show responsible? Was the constant moving responsible? Was the financial pressure responsible? Was the family structure itself responsible? The honest answer is that Maddie's comments don't give us a simple one-person explanation. Her experience was shaped by many circumstances, and we shouldn't put words into her mouth. What she has done is tell us what she wants to do differently. That is where the strongest story actually exists. Today, Maddie's children aren't growing up in the same environment she did. They have a home centered around Maddie and Caleb. They have a mother who has openly discussed intentional parenting. And they have grandparents who remain involved in their lives. Janelle has also become a major part of Maddie's adult world. The mother-daughter relationship has evolved into something that looks increasingly like a partnership. That is particularly interesting because Janelle was once part of the same complicated family structure Maddie is now reflecting on. Yet today, Janelle and Maddie are working together on Tata Farms and spending significant time with the grandchildren, people, calm. So the story isn't simply Maddie had a difficult childhood. The bigger story is Maddie is trying to create a different future. And that is much more compelling. For longtime viewers, this part is complicated. Janelle has generally been portrayed as one of the calmer and more practical members of the Brown family. She raised several children while navigating a plural marriage that was already complicated before cameras entered the picture. Over time, her relationship with Kody deteriorated. Eventually, Janelle became independent from the marriage, and now she's building an entirely different life. Her relationship with Maddie seems to have become one of the strongest family connections in this new era. That's why Maddie's comments about childhood hit differently. Because while she is discussing what she didn't want to repeat, she is also showing viewers what she did choose to preserve. Family, connection, motherhood, but on her own terms. Of course, Kody remains the giant shadow over this entire story, not necessarily because Maddie is constantly talking about him. In fact, that's part of what makes the situation so interesting. The less she talks about Kody, the more fans sometimes speculate about what that silence means. Their relationship has been strained. Maddie has spoken about needing consistency before reconciliation could truly happen, and that creates an enormous question. What does consistency actually look like? Is it phone calls, visits, showing up for birthdays, being involved in grandchildren's lives, taking responsibility for past mistakes? Or is it something deeper? For someone who says she grew up without knowing peace, consistency may mean something completely different from what Kody thinks it means. This is perhaps the hardest truth in the story. Even if Kody wanted to repair everything today, he can't go back and give Maddie a different childhood. He can't rewind the clock. He can't erase family conflicts. He can't remove memories. He can't change decisions that were already made. What he can do is decide what kind of father he wants to be now. And that's where Maddie's standard of consistency becomes important. Because reconciliation isn't necessarily about one emotional conversation. It can be about hundreds of small actions over time, showing up, listening, respecting boundaries, following through, being present, and proving that the relationship isn't just important when cameras are rolling or when emotions are running high. This is why her childhood revelation matters beyond Maddie herself. The Brown family has undergone one of the most dramatic transformations in reality TV history. The original plural family is gone. Christine left Kody. Mary left Kody. Janelle left Kody. Janelle left Kody. Kody and Robin are now the only married couple remaining from the original plural family structure. And the children who grew up inside that system are now adults making their own choices. Some remain close to Kody. Some have complicated relationships with him. Some have distanced themselves, and some appear to be rebuilding their identities almost entirely outside the structure that shaped their childhood. Maddie belongs to that last category in a particularly visible way. For years, Sister Wives was largely presented through the adults. Kody, Mary, Janelle, Christine, Robin. But the children grew up, and now they have their own marriages, their own careers, their own children, their own opinions, their own memories. That changes the power dynamic because the Brown parents no longer control the narrative simply by being the adults in the room. Their children can tell their own stories. And Maddie's story is becoming increasingly independent from the story her parents once told about their family. Think about what Maddie could have said. She could have said, my childhood was difficult, but she didn't stop there. The idea of peace is much more revealing because peace isn't simply the absence of arguments. Peace can mean knowing where you stand, knowing who will be there, knowing you don't have to constantly adapt to someone else's changing expectations, knowing your home is emotionally predictable, knowing that when your child needs you, you're there. And perhaps that is exactly what Maddie has been trying to build. Not a perfect life, a predictable one. Imagine being Maddie. You've spent years creating a life that feels stable. Then there is a person from your childhood with whom you have unresolved issues, a person you may still love, a person you may still want a relationship with, but a person whose presence could potentially bring old emotions back into your life. How do you balance those two things? That's the question. And Maddie's answer appears to be boundaries, not hatred, not revenge. Not necessarily permanent rejection, boundaries. And that's why her comments about consistency are so important. She isn't necessarily saying, I never want to see my father again. She's saying, in effect, if you want to be part of my life, your actions have to match your words. That is a very different message. There's another emotional dimension fans don't always discuss. Maddie's children are growing up. Eventually, they will learn about the family history. They will see old Sister Wives episodes. They will hear stories. They will understand that their grandparents once lived very differently. And someday they may ask, Mom, what was it like? What will Maddie tell them? That question may be one of the biggest reasons she is so determined to process her own childhood now, because children inherit more than DNA. They inherit stories. They inherit family narratives. They inherit coping mechanisms. They inherit the things their parents haven't healed from. And Maddie appears determined not to hand her children the unresolved pieces of her own upbringing. That's an important distinction. Maddie doesn't have to pretend her childhood never happened. She doesn't have to hate her family. She doesn't have to reject every part of the world she came from. She can acknowledge the good. She can acknowledge the difficult. And she can choose something different. That's what makes her story relatable even to people who have never watched Sister Wives. Because almost every family has patterns. Some are healthy, some aren't. And eventually, every adult gets to decide, which ones do I keep? Which ones do I change? Which ones end with me? Maddie's answer appears to be very clear. And this is where the story becomes especially interesting heading into the next chapter of Sister Wives. What happens if Kody actually tries to rebuild these relationships? Not through a dramatic speech, not through a television episode, but through consistent action. Could Maddie eventually soften? Could she allow Kody back into her life? Could the grandchildren become a bridge? Could Janelle's new chapter somehow bring different members of the family closer together? Or has too much time passed? Because there is one thing Maddie's recent comments make crystal clear. She is no longer the little girl waiting for adults to decide what happens next. She's an adult. She's a mother, and she gets to decide who has access to the peaceful life she's built. Maddie's story isn't really about whether she will forgive Kody. That's too simple. The real question is, can Kody become the kind of father Maddie now needs, rather than simply expecting her to accept the father he has always been? Because those are two very different things. And if Maddie truly believes consistency is the foundation of reconciliation, then words won't be enough. Time will tell. Actions will tell. And ultimately, Maddie will decide. But there's another Brown family story that makes this even more complicated. Because Maddie isn't the only adult child who has been reconsidering what growing up in the Brown family actually meant. And as more of the Brown children speak about their experiences, fans are beginning to see a picture of the family that is much more complicated than the version presented during the early seasons. Maddie Brush's recent reflections have given Sister Wives fans a completely different perspective on the Brown family story. She isn't simply looking back and criticizing her childhood. She's explaining how those experiences influenced the woman and mother she became. Her message is simple. She wants her children to grow up with the peace and stability she says she didn't fully understand as a child. And that may be the most powerful thing about her story. Maddie cannot change the past. She cannot erase the difficult moments. She cannot go back and become the child she wishes she could have been, but she can decide what happens next. And when it comes to Kody, that decision appears to come down to one thing: consistency. If Kody truly wants to rebuild his relationship with Maddie and eventually become more present in the lives of his grandchildren, emotional promises won't be enough. He would have to show up, he would have to listen, he would have to respect boundaries, And most importantly, he would have to prove through his actions that the relationship matters because Maddie is no longer waiting for someone else to create peace for her. She has created it herself. And perhaps that's the biggest transformation we've seen from Kody Brown's daughter. The little girl who couldn't control her childhood has become a mother who is determined to control the environment her own children grow up in. So the question now isn't simply whether Maddie will forgive Kody. The real question is, will Kody do enough to earn his way back into her life? And as the Brown children continue telling their own stories, fans may finally discover just how much the family has changed behind the scenes. One thing is certain. Maddie has found her voice, and she's not afraid to use it. If you enjoyed this update, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because the next Sister Wives update could reveal even more about the Brown family's new chapter.